AWS Code Deploy Description. Automated application deployments to EC2, on-premises servers, AWS Lambda, and ECS. Prerequisites: AWS account, Code Deploy agent on instances. Use cases: deploy applications to multiple instances. Rollback deployments, manage deployment configurations. Steps: create an application, create a deployment group, configure deployment configuration, create a deployment. Challenges and fixes: deployment failures, fixes, retry the deployment, troubleshoot deployment logs, check for insufficient permissions or in-role issues, verify code deploy agent status and connectivity, inspect deployment configuration for any misconfigurations, review application code for any errors or compatibility issues, ensure the deployment environment meets the application's requirements. Slow deployments, fixes: optimize deployment configuration, reduce the size of deployment artifacts, utilize a faster deployment strategy, e.g., canary, linear, improve network bandwidth and latency between the deployment source and target instances. Consider using parallel deployments to distribute workload across multiple instances. Deployment conflicts, fixes: use a different deployment configuration. Ensure that the application is compatible with the deployment environment. Verify that the deployment environment is properly configured. Utilize a rolling deployment strategy for gradual updates. Code deploy agent issues, fixes: restart the code deploy agent. Update the code deploy agent. Verify code deploy agent logs for errors or warnings. Ensure the code deploy agent is properly installed and configured. Check for any firewall or security group restrictions that may be blocking agent communication. Security issues, fixes: use in-roles to control access to code deploy. Configure security groups to restrict access to deployment instances. Implement least privilege principle for in-roles. Encrypt deployment artifacts and communication channels. Regularly audit and monitor code deploy activity. Cost optimization, fixes: use spot instances for deployments. Utilize AWS Lambda for small deployments. Optimize deployment configuration for cost efficiency. Leverage reserved instances or spot fleets for predictable workloads. Scalability issues, fixes: use multiple deployment groups for large deployments. Configure deployment configurations for different deployment scenarios. Utilize auto-scaling groups for dynamic scaling of deployment resources. Consider using a blue-green deployment strategy for seamless transitions. Monitoring and logging, fixes: use CloudWatch to monitor deployments. Configure code deploy to send logs to S3 or CloudWatch logs. Integrate with monitoring tools like Prometheus or Grafana. Set up alerts and notifications for critical events. Integration with other AWS services, fixes: integrate with AWS Code Pipeline for continuous integration and delivery. Integrate with AWS CloudFormation for infrastructure as code. Utilize AWS Code Build for automated build and testing processes. Integrate with AWS S3 for storing and managing deployment artifacts. Disaster recovery, fixes: use multiple deployment groups in different regions. Configure deployment configurations for disaster recovery scenarios. Utilize AWS Lambda for disaster recovery automation. Implement cross-region failover mechanisms. Version control, fixes: integrate with Git or other version control systems. Track changes to deployments. Utilize deployment tags or labels for versioning. Automation, fixes: use the AWS CLI or SDK to automate deployments. Integrate with other automation tools. Utilize AWS CloudFormation for infrastructure as code deployments. Compliance. Fixes. Use AWS Code Deploy to meet regulatory requirements. Configure deployment configurations for compliance. Implement security controls and audits for compliance. Security auditing. Fixes. Monitor deployment logs for security events. Use AWS CloudTrail to audit code deploy activity. Configure security monitoring and alerting. Performance optimization. Fixes. Use a deployment configuration with an appropriate deployment strategy. Ensure that the deployment environment is optimized for performance. Utilize load balancing and caching mechanisms for improved performance. Optimize application code for efficiency and resource utilization. High availability. Fixes. Use multiple deployment groups in different availability zones. Configure deployment configurations for high availability. Utilize auto-scaling groups for redundancy and fault tolerance. Disaster recovery. Fixes. Use multiple deployment groups in different regions. Configure deployment configurations for disaster recovery scenarios. Implement cross-region failover and replication mechanisms. Rollback. Fixes. Use the rollback feature to revert to a previous deployment. Ensure that the rollback process is automated. Configure rollback strategies for different scenarios. Deployment monitoring. Fixes. Monitor deployment status and logs. Use CloudWatch alarms to trigger notifications for deployment failures. Utilize dashboards and visualization tools for monitoring deployment progress. Deployment security. Fixes. Use ing roles to control access to code deploy. Configure security groups to restrict access to deployment instances. Implement security best practices for deployment environments. Deployment automation. Fixes. Use the AWS CLI or SDK to automate deployments. Integrate with other automation tools. Utilize CI/CD pipelines for automated deployments. Deployment best practices. Fixes. Use a systematic approach to deployments. Test deployments thoroughly before deploying to production. Document all deployment procedures. Implement version control for deployment artifacts. Follow secure development practices for deployment environments. Deployment troubleshooting. Fixes. Use deployment logs to identify and resolve issues. Seek assistance from AWS support if necessary. Consult AWS documentation and community forums for troubleshooting guidance. Use debugging tools and techniques to pinpoint issues.